Before we get started, this is going to be a discussion about conventional wisdom, but I would like all of you to participate. The first thing that I want you to do is I want you to think of potentially the dirtiest word that you know. Now, if you're offended by the person next to you, don't listen to them, all right? Think of the word. Keep it in the forefront of your mind. Suddenly this feels like a magic trick, but it's not. All right. So on the count of 3, I'm not going to be asking you to say the word because that would be terrible. However, though, I can guarantee you that no matter what word you are thinking about, the word that I'm about to say is far worse than the word that is currently existing in your mind. And what is the word? And I'm going to say my word out loud because I'm up here on stage and I have the authority to do that. But the word that I'm going to say is going to top your word. And that word is appeasement. And I'm going to argue today that appeasement is not what you think it is. But however, the word appeasement, when you really think about the word appeasement, it does say it like appeasement. It feels like you're mashing like a ripe fruit through your fingers, right? Appeasement. Appeasement, the conventional wisdom regarding appeasement is that appeasement was potentially the worst thing to happen in the entire 20th century, if not the entire gamut of human history. And, I work a lot with debaters, young debaters, older debaters. Debaters are amazing people because they constantly question conventional wisdom. Their job is to take a statement that seems to be a truth and then subvert that statement to find some sort of alternative meaning for it. However, debaters, and I've been with them for a decade, they often use shorthand still. And they offer up statements within debate rounds, these competitive rounds, that on the surface, nobody really questions because they have become so embedded in the historical narrative or ideological narrative of our current world. For example, something that often comes up in rounds is that North Korea is an irrational actor, or that debt and deficits are always bad, or alternatively, that appeasement was wrong. And so just to provide a little background information regarding appeasement, well, what is appeasement? I'm sure the word, when I said it, many of you were thinking of bad. This is a bad thing. What specifically is appeasement? And who is the individual most closely associated with this idea? And that person is a man named Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England in 1938. And it's easy to understand why debaters always consider appeasement to be bad, because when I teach, it's such a simple narrative, and students really understand it, because it establishes this in the figure of Adolf Hitler in 1938, this seminal individual associated with evil, and you have Neville Chamberlain on the other side representing England, and the story always goes, if Neville Chamberlain, if England, and if France in 1938 had stood up to Adolf Hitler, the entirety of the awfulness of the 20th century, which is one of the most brutal centuries in human history, all of that could have been avoided. And the city most associated with this seemingly incredible mistake is the city of Munich, Germany, where in September 29th, 1938, Neville Chamberlain Daladier of France, Benito Mussolini from Italy, and Adolf Hitler, of course, representing Germany. That's a crazy crowd when you think about it. Sat down and tried to decide or figure out a final sort of, I don't know, conclusion to a problem that Hitler had put into play. And the problem is that Hitler was demanding that Western Czechoslovakia, a country that had only been around for a short period of time, that Western Czechoslovakia be handed over to Germany. And Hitler's sort of argument was that the majority of people in Western Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, were Germans, and so therefore should actually be part of this larger German empire. And Neville Chamberlain, 70 years old, sat down across from Hitler. Czechoslovakia was an ally of England. The representatives of Czechoslovakia were outside of the room wondering what the heck was going on during this discussion. And ultimately, what happened is that the leaders of France and Neville Chamberlain of England told Adolf Hitler that he would be allowed to take apart a neighboring country that was an ally of England and of France. And then the story goes from there, of course, that this is the moment that emboldened Adolf Hitler. That this is what gave him the strength and I guess the determination and the realization that France and England, the two strongest nations in Europe outside of Germany, would do absolutely nothing to stop Hitler's takeover of all of Europe. This is like a sin that's akin to like almost original sin like in the Bible. This is viewed as one of the grossest mistakes of the 20th century. If only France and England had stood up to Hitler, he might have been stopped. As time has progressed since this decision in 1938, historians have been more kind to Neville Chamberlain. I think one of the things that they begin to state as very important to follow is that we have to look at the context of the time Neville Chamberlain was operating in. And they bring up a litany of facts, such as, well, by the late 1930s, England, for all intents and purposes, was not doing very well financially. They had a global empire, and they were spending a lot of money trying to sustain this empire during the Great Depression. Also, England had made a decision during the 1930s to pursue a policy of disarmament, right? So that in response to Hitler's growing power during the 1930s, they made the decision that perhaps the best way to avoid war would be to remove weapons, become less of a threat, right? And so also, Chamberlain in 1938, his own military leadership had told him that, look, if we go to war against Adolf Hitler, if we go to war in 1938 against Nazi Germany, we can't necessarily guarantee that we are going to win this war. Also, Chamberlain, if we go to war against Adolf Hitler now, the estimates given to Chamberlain at the time were in the first few weeks of a war against Nazi Germany, they will begin bombing England, and the potential death toll could be 500,000 people. And so, armed with this information, many historians have gone on to sort of conclude that what Chamberlain did when he sat down with Adolf Hitler in 1938 was that he played a game of poker and that he had essentially made the decision with the realization that he was holding a very weak hand. And so when Neville Chamberlain returns to England on September 30th and steps out of the plane, he did the best that he could under the circumstances. And he pulls a piece of paper out of his suit pocket. He reads it and declares that with the signature on this paper, he has achieved peace for our time because handing over Czechoslovakia to Adolf Hitler will help England avoid going to war. And the crowd cheers. And I think that is one of the great sort of moments in terms of trying to understand what is happening here, because Chamberlain is the individual who is blamed over and over for Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany achieving such brutal power at the end of the 1930s. But I think that cheer from the crowd is important to pay attention to, because that crowd and its enthusiasm for appeasement, that crowd is the crowd that Neville Chamberlain had to convince that war would be the right action. The vast majority of the people in England were supportive of appeasement, supportive of avoiding war against Nazi Germany. Put in mind, it was only 20 years prior that World War I had come to a conclusion. And just think back 20 years. 20 years ago, if you're old enough. Many of you can't go back 20 years until you go, unless you're in the womb, I don't know. But 20 years ago, think about it, 20 years. Clinton's impeachment. 20 years ago, dot-com boom, #1. 20 years ago, Steve Young throws a pass to Terrell Owens and they finally beat the Packers in a wild card game. Those memories, if you only go back 20 years, those memories are still fresh. They're still fairly vivid. And now put into place what the British population was feeling is that in 1918, 20 years prior to appeasement, we had 800,000 soldiers killed in World War I. We had 1.6 million soldiers injured. It was a travesty of just death and mutilation that England had never seen, and so the population wanted Chamberlain to avoid war. The problem with democracies, to some degree, is that the leaderships of a democracy are accountable to the people. Look at FDR, trying to get the American population to go to war against Germany. It's tough. And so what I'm going to posit here is that what Chamberlain did at Munich with Adolf Hitler wasn't a game of poker. He approached the table and sat down with Adolf Hitler and actually refused to play the game. Chamberlain gave Hitler everything he wanted. And then Hitler leaves the table. In what should have been a moment of triumph, he is described as being morose and in a tremendously dark mood. Now, why? He had just gotten everything that he wanted. The reality was, and I want you to just sort of posit this, is that Hitler, at this moment in 1938, he wanted war. He wanted to go to war against England. He wanted to go to war against France because he felt that in 1938 that these two countries were vulnerable. And when he sat down with France and England and Mussolini, he was anticipating that these countries would say, no, you will not take Western Czechoslovakia. We are going to stand up to you. He was expecting this, and then he could rally the German people to go to war against England. He was in that meeting waiting for England to say no. And instead what occurred is that Chamberlain, at the table with Hitler, basically said, we're not even going to play. you can take whatever you want. Now, why did he do this? I think there's an alternative way of looking at this, is that the reason Chamberlain made this decision is, what did he need? He needed time. He needed time to get England to rearm. He needed time to prep England for war. He needed the time to also demonstrate to the British people that Adolf Hitler is an individual who cannot keep his word. And so what occurs in March of 1939 is that Adolf Hitler cannot maintain the fact that he only has Western Czechoslovakia and orders a military occupation of the entire country. Now, why is this important? Because it puts on full display to the British people that Adolf Hitler is a man who cannot be trusted. He is a man that will violate any agreement. He is a man that you cannot work with, and he is a man that will basically spit in the face of a Prime Minister of England, and that he has basically ambitions to take over and conquer all of Europe. He's just not trying to create a German empire. He is trying to bring all of Europe under his control. And why is this important? It's because at this moment in 1939, the British people see the curtain pulled back and see Adolf Hitler for who he is. And public perception changes regarding the war. And so what did appeasement do? Well, one, it allowed Chamberlain to order the buildup of the British military. And two, it brought the British people from being staunchly opposed to the war over to the side of being for going to war against Adolf Hitler. And so by 1940, when Chamberlain is removed and Winston Churchill takes over, Winston Churchill takes control of a country whose Air Force is now 10 times larger than it was in 1938. And so to some degree, you could argue that the decision to appease Hitler wasn't just Chamberlain playing cards. It was Chamberlain buying the necessary time and exposing Hitler for the monster he was. And so, when we want to bring this back around to the beginning of the presentation, is the word appeasement. So when I say the word now, my hope is that you will recoil, of course, a little bit, because it's bad to be called an appeaser, but that you will understand that a word is charged as appeasement might have some grain or some minuscule sheen that can cause you to also nod along and say, that might have been the decision that actually helped preserve Europe and preserve democracy. Thank you.